Hello there, everybody. Welcome along to EFL Debate. I'm covering all 72 clubs across the EFL between mid-June and mid-July. There's already been some uploaded to YouTube and Spotify, so go check those out and give them a follow, a subscribe, a notification, and all that good stuff. Once you're done with this episode, and this one is on Peterborough United. They missed out via the playoffs last season. So what's in store for the Posh this time around? Talk of going down a younger route. So we're really interested to talk about what the strategy is really for Peterborough United and what we can expect. And who better to be joined to discuss all this than Tim Stoodley from the excellent Yellow Block podcast. Thanks for dropping on the podcast, Tim.
Oh, you're too kind. No problem at all. It's my pleasure. It's good to see you again as well. It's fills that void between seasons, which is a bit of a barren zone for football fans just now.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad we can keep people entertained to some extent. I suppose the first question is I've heard talk of 23-24 being a little bit of a scaling back season for Peterborough United, where you're going towards a younger, more developmental model where the academy's doing well, and yet it feels a little bit strange for me from an outside point of view because I've always associated Darragh MacAnthony with being such an ambitious chairman, with Darren Ferguson winning 5 promotions with the Posh. It almost doesn't feel quite right. So, how are you feeling from a Posh perspective?
Yeah, I've got to be honest with you, Gab. It's a worrying summer, I think, for most Posh fans. You summed it up perfectly. We're having. They're framing it as a new chapter, a new approach. The reality is we're having issues off the field. I fully expect more of them to come to the fore over the next few weeks. We know that there's issues around the ownership and the way that they're getting along as a trio. So I think really what we're being lined up for as fans at the moment is to actually temper our expectations. Posh fans go into most seasons feeling as though the playoffs is a minimum, and very often we go into it hoping for better, and if we have a good summer, the expectations rise. And you mentioned about Darragh there; he's at the forefront of that. He brings up expectations every summer. He hypes up signings and players. I think what we're seeing this year is a different tactic intentionally. I think he knows alongside the other owners that they need to keep the fans not at bay, but tempered slightly in what we expect going into this season, because quite frankly, we just don't have the capital at the moment. We are likely to have to sell assets. It's an unusual summer for Posh in that respect.
Yeah. What is the ownership situation at the moment?
Yeah, so this is all very kind of, Twitter rumours doing their thing. We do know as pure facts that 3 owners currently at the club. One of them recently called in his debt a couple of months ago and took ownership or took control, I should say, of the stadium in doing so. For a few weeks, it looked like we were going to find ourselves in a Coventry situation whereby we might not be able to access our own stadium and our own ground. Looks as though that's settled itself down slightly, but that issue is still there. We know that there are fractions within that trio. Darragh and Jason, 2 of the owners, tend to get on quite well, but Randy, the 3rd owner, seems to have been pushed out. That's an outside perspective, so that may not be the reality. But we are expecting there to be a few earthquakes at the club, let's say, over the summer as that ownership situation sorts itself out. What that looks like yet, I don't know. Whether they will try to buy Randy out, whether or not Randy will remain at the club, but will want to take more of a control. And we know that last season decisions were made without Randy being aware of this. So, for example, when Grant McCann was released and Darren Ferguson came back, the first Randy knew about that allegedly is by reading it on Twitter. So that there's clearly issues behind the scenes, I think, and I suspect that's why we're being pitched this idea of we're going to go young and hungry. I guess what's interesting for me is they keep saying we're taking this new approach, young and hungry, buying young players for very little money. But ironically, that's all we've done really in the Darragh MacAnthony era. So I think it's less of a new approach and more of a everyone just needs to settle down and be happy with mid-table, I suspect.
Yeah, do you know what? It's I have a lot of sympathy for owners in that, because if you are in a position where you do need to scale back, you're kind of in this balance where you want to be transparent and honest with the supporters, and yet at the same time, part of the job is a little bit of the marketing side of thing, a little bit selling season tickets. So I remember Darragh MacAnthony saying on his podcast that it was Darren Ferguson saying, "I want to go young and hungry, and I'm going to go for a real exciting." And you kind of wonder whether how much of that came from Darren Ferguson, how much of it was actually no, we have got to go with young unproven players. But to flip that onto a positive, I suppose, Tim, if now is a time where the club has to lean on youth a bit more, the good thing is that the club is at a stage where the academy has probably been as successful as it's ever been in the last couple of years. So we've seen Ronnie Edwards come through the conveyor belt, and I believe the under-18s won a trophy last season as well.
Yeah, correct. Absolutely. Excuse me. And Jason Neal, one of the owners I mentioned there, he deserves huge credit for that. He very quickly realised when he came into the club that just buying from non-league and selling on is a limited business model, and it needs a second avenue, and that's why he invested heavily in the youth academy, which is coming to fruition. You're quite right there. There are a few assets in the first team already. Ronnie Edwards, you mentioned, Harrison Burrows, and there's a conveyor belt of more coming through. And if we are taking this approach of having to look to the youth players a little bit more, then that will only benefit them. As a I suppose as a side point, you mentioned with Darren Ferguson there, he's proven with young players. So, there is you're quite right, there is a benefit there and a positive. I suppose it's just as Posh fans, our identity is maybe at risk slightly, without kind of over dramatizing everything. We're known, I'd like to think from the outside at least, as a club that likes to attack, buys flair players, is always looking to outscore oppositions. And I worry that if we are looking for a new route to navigate through League One, will we lose our identity a bit? I'm not entirely sure. I guess we just have to trust the ownership here. The challenge there, and this is very much just my personal opinion, is it's hard to trust an ownership that has a history, let's say, of saying things and then not necessarily following through on them. So if we take Darragh, for example, he's probably told us he's leaving about 7 times now and then never does. He says a lot of stuff in the heat of the moment, a lot of stuff on his podcast to create sound bites. And so as a Posh fan, you spend a lot of your life trying to work out what's reality, and what is Darragh being Darragh ultimately.
Yeah, I can see he's a very sort of intense guy, and even the Darren Ferguson situation. I remember Darragh speaking on his podcast saying they were looking at other managers, and Darren Ferguson knew he was in there just to the end of the season. It was only a stopgap, and they'd go their separate ways, and then all of a sudden you see Darren Ferguson has that 3-year contract. I suppose. Do you in some ways welcome that bit of stability with having a manager that you've probably your most successful manager in the 21st century for Peterborough United?
In a word, no.
Really?
I was never a fan of Darren coming back. I understand why he did. I guess it makes a bit of a mockery of the club from the outside looking in. If I'm a fan of one of the other 72 clubs, I'm looking at what Posh are doing and kind of wondering the method in the madness there. Yes, he is absolutely our most successful manager, but he's also the only manager that's been given the time and the freedom to do things his way. We only really deviated from the Darragh MacAnthony plan A once, and that was really with hiring Steve Evans, who has quite a defined way of working. Outside of that, we've only really had managers that will work alongside.
Graham Westley was a little bit away from the blueprint as well.
Correct, and that's why there were issues between him and the ownership in terms of the way that they wanted to point the club. And all the time that Darragh is there, ultimately, it will need to be a manager that fits Darragh rather than a manager that fits the club as such. And Darren works so well with Darragh, and they're great friends, and that's ultimately why we keep going back to that tried and tested method. I think we hit a glass ceiling with Darragh a few years ago. And a model that worked incredibly well 6-7 years ago maybe doesn't now. So we welcome change, of course we do, because I think the club needs it. I'm just not sure that this young and hungry philosophy we're being fed is a change, really, because ultimately we've made our money on buying players from non-league, turning them good in some cases, and then making money. But I think I've said to yourself before, for every Ivan Toney that we get through that makes us millions and millions of pounds, we get a lot that aren't Ivan Toney, without naming any names, and so we do need a new dynamic, and that, for me, that would start with a manager with different ideas, who's given the freedom and the resources to manage how he believes would be best for the club. And if that means it takes a couple of years of nothingness in League One, that's absolutely fine.
You've talked there about a glass ceiling, Tim, and I understand what you mean in terms of the model. I'm not saying it's the perfect model, and I'm not saying Darragh MacAnthony hasn't made mistakes, but there's also part of me that wonders. And I feel like, people will say, when I say this, that I'm almost parroting Darren MacAnthony, which isn't the intention. But the club was in League Two when he took charge, and I don't have a vast history of knowledge of the history of Peterborough United, but it seems to have been a club with a history of maybe going between the third and fourth tiers. And now, and in more recent years, the club's got to a point where it's expected to challenge for promotion from League One. Now, it hasn't always achieved that, but it's certainly been more successful than it had been for quite a while, I would suggest. So is there an element of the expectations having been risen as well, perhaps beyond the natural point?
Yeah, and it's a really, really good point. And to be fair, it's a point that a lot of our fan base, particularly the older generation, make very much one of. We need to remember where we were before Darragh came. I mean, we had players getting changed in their cars, for example, because they wouldn't come into the dressing room. It was, you're absolutely right. But look, that's well over a decade now. It's like 15 years ago. And Darragh will always be remembered fondly for coming in, taking that and turning us into a top-end League One club without question. Without question, he will. However, I believe personally that he once he reached that pinnacle, which was promotion to the Championship, that was the point where he then needed to look for a different route for the future of the club, be that with or without him. I do believe that he did intend to, by bringing in the other co-owners, the other two owners, but it's not really worked out necessarily how I believe he would have expected it to. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, Darragh, and I'm sure he would admit this. He brought the club as a bit of a playset. It was, it wasn't that he was a big Peterborough fan. He wanted to get into football. Peterborough was available. Got it for a quid. Yes, he took on the debts, and he had a bit of fun with it. And for a decade, it was the best football we've seen. We were playing some great football with some great players. We've had promotions. We've had the odd little cup run every now and again. So. Yeah, and we forged a good reputation from it. But I just think it's reached that point where there needs to be a change. I suppose it's like getting in a relationship with a partner. You have a great few years, everything's wonderful, and they make you a better person. But ultimately, it's about recognizing at what point that relationship's run its course, because there's nothing worse than staying in that relationship purely because it was once good.
Sure.
Because all that happens is all parties end up unhappy, and ultimately you end up regressing and going backwards.
Yeah, well, hopefully Peterborough can avoid that. I feel like from what you said at the top of the show, Tim, that it's going to be difficult to predict the number of outgoings, because the financial situation and what that sort of entails in terms of the playing budget and sales is still a little bit unclear. But who are the major? I mean, Ronnie Edwards would be the first one. You've also got Ephron Mason-Clark, who had an excellent second half of last season. Are those the two that are the ones that could command the big fees?
Yeah, potentially. I mean, the only real kind of business we've had so far is Joe Ward going on a free to Derby. I'm surprised that we haven't had more. Our retained list was, for the odd surprise, so Johnson Clark Harris, obviously 2 times League One Golden Boot winner, kind of been a stalwart of the club for the last few years. He was on the transfer list. Ronnie Edwards wasn't, but I fully expect him to go. In fact, if I'm honest, I think a deal was probably done back in January for Ronnie Edwards.
Mm.
I'm expecting him to go, excuse me, either to Germany or to a Premiership club.
You're probably not going to get 8 figures, though. I think that's what Darragh MacAnthony had hoped for, I think, a year or two ago. But
that's Darragh doing Darragh's thing and trying to up the price slightly. But no, I do expect Ronnie Edwards to go. You mentioned Mason Clark. I think either Mason Clark or Poku, I think one of those two will go. I'd be surprised if they both went.
I'd say probably more likely Mason Clark. I think he'd be the more appealing proposition. Personally.
Yeah, but then at the same time, I wouldn't be surprised if, given the fact we're going to end up with a very thin squad, if it's not a case of we sell him but we get him back for a year, for example, to continue his development. Because if I'm a Championship or a Premiership club looking at Mason Clark, he's not going to make it into my squad yet. I don't think he's quite Championship qualities, so I'm going to invest in him now. Loan him back to Peterborough, where we know Darren Ferguson will develop him. He'll get the game time and kind of see where we are in a few months. In terms of other assets, I think Jack Taylor's at risk of going as well. I wouldn't be surprised if he goes.
Yeah, what a player he's been last few years.
Absolutely. I think Ollie Norburn will probably go back up northwest, probably end up back at Blackpool. Fuchs will probably go. He's fallen out of favour. Frankie Ken, Josh Knight, all of the. I mean, if I'm honest, there's not really anyone safe, I wouldn't say, in that starting 11, apart from
it's like a murder mystery. It's like the next
it's going to be I think even Janet the Tea Lady's at risk this summer, if I'm completely honest. But we will see.
Yeah, absolutely. That's tickled me. So who are the next ones coming through the academy that are the ones that really could step up into first team roles?
Yeah, so it's it's been a good season for the under 18s. I know that when Jason Neal took over, he had this goal of having a certain number of youth team players featuring in the first team squad each year. I think in answer to your question, it will depend purely on who goes out and what spaces open up. There's a couple of star names in that, well, not star names, but there's a couple of players that are garnishing a good reputation in that youth squad. But Harrison Burrows is a name we've only really mentioned once there, but he's a local lad. He's come through the academy. He's found himself one of the first names on the team sheet, and yet weirdly never gets really talked about, particularly when we're talking about players that might go this summer and so on and so forth. It just
on Harrison Burrows, actually, Tim, if you don't mind me jumping in, would you say he weirdly actually had a better season in the Championship than he had in League One?
He did. I think a lot of the problem with Harrison Burrows is he's had to be the square peg filling a round hole. He's played several different positions. I think Darren Ferguson and Grant McCann, if I'm honest, struggled to find his best position. I feel like we've found that now. For me, he's a number 10. However, the only problem with that role, and he does flourish in that role, is you do lose his crossing ability. I've not seen many players, even at Championship level when we've been there, that can deliver a ball quite like Harrison Burrows. I've no doubt he will go higher. I just find it strange, and I know it doesn't necessarily answer your question about which youth players to look for, but I find it strange that he's never really mentioned about players that can go on to achieve stuff. It's all about star boy Ronnie Edwards. I don't understand why, because I've no doubt Ronnie Edwards will go on to play for England, but Harrison Burrows is another name.
You're still confident about that, even though last season, in terms of the basics, he wasn't necessarily always on it.
Yeah, but it's he's so young, but his composure on the ball, his ability to find an outlet, his ability to stay calm, his composure, his decision making, that's all come on in the last 24 months. And I feel like with Ronnie Edwards, he's kind of accidentally found himself at the right club at the right time in Posh, because he kind of got forced into the first team because of issues around squad depth, particularly at the back. But he's taken to it like a duck to water, and it's very, very rare at Posh where you get a defender who fills you with confidence. Because we're such an attacking team, you could put a great defender in that team, but they will find their weaknesses will be exploited. With Ronnie Edwards, you always feel confident. He's by far not the finished product. There's definitely rough around the edges, but given his age, I don't doubt at all. I mean, he's consistently making the England youth setup. He was for two of the squads last year. He was the only player outside of the top two tiers to make the England youth setup. So yeah, I don't doubt he will go on to make the England squad. He's great. But then what do I know about football? Because when we had Mendes Lang at the club, I thought he was destined for non-league, and look what he went on to achieve. So.
Yeah. No, he was a great player in the end for Posh, wasn't he? Yes, the other one I wanted to ask you about, his name escapes me, but I think he was on loan in the National League last season with, I want to say, Bromley. Do you think there's players like that could maybe come into the side next year?
Yeah, so we've got a few that we've had we've had away on loan last year in non-league. It could be Fernandez potentially that you're thinking of at the back. I'm just trying to remember who went off to Bromley, but it's I mean it's
having an emergency search here,
an emergency Google. Yeah,
yes,
no,
exactly,
it's I mean we've got a few.
Charlie O'Connell went to
Charlie
Woking.
O'Connell, yes, that was right. Bromley, yeah. So I mean, he's one. Yeah, I mean, there's a few coming through. It's not. I think that the problem that we've got this summer, I guess, is ultimately whoever we bring through from the youth team, there's not enough depth in that youth team to fill the void that we're going to have in that first team squad. So we are going to have to recruit, whether we like it or not, whether that's, players that are from non-league, whether that's players on loan, whatever it might be. At the moment, for example, we don't have anyone at right back. We've got no recognised right back. Similar on the left if Dan Butler goes. We've got maybe two defenders, but they're both on the transfer list if we disregard Ronnie Edwards. We've just talked about our entire midfield going this summer there. So, and then obviously if Clark Harris goes, I think we're down to about 5 players. So even if we do bring through, and you're right with O'Connell, even if we do bring through these players that are building a good reputation, no disrespect to Bromley. I've got a mate that's a really good Bromley fan, but we can't be bringing in players that were at Bromley and doing okay last year and expect them to flourish in League One.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I like Joe Tomlinson, who was at Swindon last season. I think he's got a lot of quality. I think he's got a really good passing range. The left back. So if you need a left back to come in,
well, unfortunately, he's another one that's been put on the transfer list. So he's another. he's going with Janet the Tea Lady. No, the problem with Tomlinson, he's a puzzle to Posh fans. So he came in, played a couple of games, looked pretty solid to be fair. Then went out on loan at a point where we had no recognised left backs because I'm pretty sure Dan Butler had got injured at the time. So we couldn't quite work out why he went on loan. He absolutely bossed it on loan, came back, then got put out on loan again, and has come back and been put on the transfer list. I suspect, reading between the lines, there's maybe something happening off the pitch, whether that be, I don't know, maybe his attitude, perhaps he's fallen out with certain members of the management team. I don't know. But yeah, he's looking good. He's looking like a decent player. He would absolutely make it into my first 11. But he's probably going to be out the door. So, yeah, we'll see.
I think I might make it into your first 11.
At this rate, if you bring your boots down, you probably are, to be fair.
Yeah, I'm happy to hop on the train and then get my kit sorted. Yeah, so obviously it's a huge rebuild for the Posh this summer. Do you have any inkling on the sort of scope for bringing players in that's going to be there, and what sort of markets are you expecting? Under 21s pickups from Premier League clubs, or?
Yeah, I think it probably will be. It'll probably be non-league. It's where we tend to sort of normally dip in and do our business.
You've got to pay transfer fees for non-league as well, though.
We do. I suppose a lot depends on. Because ultimately, if this ownership situation sorts itself out and we do sell Ronnie Edwards, we do sell Johnson Clark Harris, then we will have money to spend. So maybe that will change the thinking slightly. But no, I'm fully expecting it to be players from non-league that, as EFL fans, we've maybe not heard of, or that we've only heard briefly. There's no normally at this point we've started to get names rumoured, and we start to kind of there's a bit of a standing joke between Posh fans about who's been spotted at KFC on London Road. I think that stems from a few years back where a couple of our signings were first spotted in KFC before they were announced by the club. But there's been no rumours there. KFC watch at the moment has come up dry. So yeah, it's just a case of of where we go next. And the youth team as well. So we talk about bringing players through, but a lot of the youth players have been released. The youth setup's changing. So the players that we had at that level that we could maybe look to bring up there, there's a lot of inconsistency there as well. It's going to be a rough summer, I think. But as we said earlier, I do wonder if maybe that's the picture that they're trying to paint, so that our expectation is low going into the next season. But I suppose time will tell with that one.
Time will tell, yeah. And I think it's going to be a big season for David Ajiboye, Tim, because last season you had the luxury of being able to loan him back to Sutton when he maybe didn't hit the ground running because of the other options you had in those attacking and wide positions. This year, I suspect there's a good chance if Ajiboye has a good pre-season, he's going to go straight into that first 11, which does excite me a little bit because in the 21-22 season, he really impressed me for Sutton with his pace, with his energy. He's an unpredictable winger. He can go either way. I don't quite know why it didn't go to plan for him last season, but for me, I think with a good pre-season, there's a chance that David Ajiboye could come to the fore.
Yeah, and even more so if we do lose one of either Mason Clark or Poku as well, then I think he would be that natural replacement. I mean, we've got a couple of players like that who you kind of not forget about as posh fans, but you kind of you don't necessarily they're not standout names, but actually they could start to develop and mold into a good player. So Hector Kipianu is another one in the middle, another good player. Yeah, absolutely. Another player who you almost, I feel bad saying it, but you do almost kind of forget he's at the club. He had a decent season, but he was never a first name on the team sheet. But certainly during the playoffs and the back end of the season, he started to come into his own. Kind of feel like if we do lose the likes of Jack Taylor, Fuchs and Norburn, he will naturally be forced into that starting 11. And actually that could be the making of him. So there's a few players like that, some of the youth players, Titchmarsh, etc. as well, that could potentially come through from the youth side and maybe go on to become decent players. Tishy Manga up front as well if Clark Harris does go.
Yeah.
Going to be a commentator's nightmare, Poshar, next year if all of these players do make it into the starting 11. But so I mean, there are a couple of options there, but there's no doubt about it that we will need to. We'll need to boost the numbers. The goalkeeping position is a perfect example. So at the minute at the club, we have Will Blackmore, who is a youth product, who has played a couple of games. He's okay, he's good, but is he ready for that consistent first team level? Probably not. The only other player at the club is Christy Pym, who threw a boot at the manager a few years back. So has been out on loan since, and I know the club are trying to get rid of, understandably.
Trying to beat him out.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's so that's just a perfect example. Do you go with Will Blackmore, who's young, inexperienced, maybe not quite there yet, or do you look for non-league and try and bring in somebody ahead of him? It's a difficult one.
Yeah, for sure. You mentioned Chishmanga there, and I suppose you almost felt for him a little bit last summer because Ferguson wasn't really going to go away from the 4-2-3-1, and so it was only really one up top, and then you got Johnson Clark Harris, who is arguably the best striker in the league, top goal scorer. So it was kind of Chishmanga coming off the bench for 15 minutes last season. Did he show anything in those cameos that suggested he could maybe step up?
Yeah, I mean, I really, really want to like the guy. I do. There's just something about him. He's full of energy. He looks like a footballer. He looks like somebody that you just really want to do well for your club. I mean, you hit the nail on the head. He was bought as a number 2 striker. He was never, purchased to be that sort of main front man. I think he probably knew that. He did come on the back of a serious injury, so there was an element around fitness. I fully expect that if Clark Harris does go, we won't buy a striker. We will just stick with him, and we'll see. I mean, I wouldn't say he's bad, but have we seen enough of him yet to make a full decision? Probably not. I think he did quite well in the playoffs. He came on and took a real pressure penalty against Wednesday. Deserves credit for that. That's kind of the highlight of his posh career just now. But yeah, we'll see. I mean, he's one to watch. I think he will be there or thereabouts in the starting 11, depending on what happens with Clark Harris.
Yeah, for sure. I'd expect Johnson Clark Harris to go sometime in the window. Similarly to what we discussed with David Ajiboye, Joel Randall was signed 2 windows ago for £1 million, and you've not had anything like the return you'd have hoped for that kind of outlay. He's obviously hasn't been helped by injuries in the last few years, but he did show a lot of potential, I thought, at Exeter. Admittedly, that was going back 2 or 3 seasons now. But is there a hope, a bit like with Ajiboye, that he can maybe, if he gets a run of games, he can maybe recapture some of the form that earned him that kind of move, and maybe comes to the fore a little bit more?
Oh, we so desperately hope so. I mean, I'm at risk of ending up with egg on my face here in 12 months' time if he has an absolute blinder of a season. But as we are now, I think Exeter have had our pants down a little bit, if I'm honest. He is nowhere near £1 million player, not even close. Now, he has had issues, as in off the pitch issues. The club have never really elaborated too much on them. There was murmurings of the fact he was relatively homesick, and he wasn't settling particularly well in the area. So I think that probably plays into it. He's never really had a run, but he's not the quality that we were sold ultimately. I agree with you. At Exeter, he was a fantastic player. However, I do think that they have played the market really, really well with Joel Randall. Now, obviously we want him to go on to be a fantastic player. Of course we do. We spent a lot of money on him. But can I see it happening? Unfortunately, I can't. No, I don't think I don't think he'll ever be any more than a bit part player for us. I can't see it. He just doesn't. Even when it's said, when the story's written for him to come on and make a difference, score that last minute winner, whatever it might be. Unfortunately, he just goes missing. I don't know if it's confidence. I fear it's actually ability. I just don't think he's good enough for this level.
I can't sit here and argue directly with your experience as a Peterborough fan, but I'd like to add a little bit of balance to what's been said, which is that I do have a very strong memory of Joel Randall going on these charging electric runs down the left for Exeter City and posing a goal threat and cutting inside onto his right foot and being a bit of an inside forward and looking so exciting. And if I'm not mistaken, I think Peterborough might have signed him after an injury, and maybe that might have affected him, maybe some of the issues that you've discussed as well. But I would like to introduce the possibility that if Joel Randall can get his head in the right place, if that's what's needed, if he can settle down, if the penny drops for him and he absolutely commits to pre-season training and really starting on the front foot, and then has a good pre-season, then comes into it and then starts, I think there's a chance. Now, I appreciate that 2 years is a relatively large sample size to judge a player on, and I can't argue with your experience, but I would like to introduce a little bit of hope that Joel Randall might come good, because I do think that he can be good enough.
I mean, that's fair, though. And his style of play, you quite rightly mentioned there, it should have suited the club down to the ground. He should have been that flair, fast wing player that we've kind of built our style on over the last few years. So no, you're absolutely right. He was, when we signed him as a fan base, we were really excited, and the fact we paid that sort of money for him as well, it was great. He was going to go on and be a great asset for the club. It's just not happened, and I guess enough time has passed now that I feel like it's not going to happen. I mean, the list of players that have a great set of teenage years and then just fall off is long, and unfortunately, I fear with Joel Randall that's probably going to be the case.
Well, let's see on that one. In terms of, are you worried about Peterborough possibly dropping into a relegation dogfight next season? Because we're sort of talking about this in terms of Peterborough maybe not being at the same stage they've been in previous seasons and possibly falling short of the playoffs. But if other teams are to strengthen, like, for example, Oxford have been able to sign Ruben Rodriguez and they finished 19th last year, and they seem to have been able to recruit well. So is there a danger that if some of the teams below Peterborough get better, that actually they do fall behind a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's furthered, I think, by the teams coming up from League Two. Fully expect them to have good seasons as well. So, yeah, I mean, a relegation fight. I mean, I've said on the Yellow Block podcast that there's a fear there of a relegation dogfight without question. I would like to think relegation is pushing it a touch, but the way that this summer's playing out, unfortunately, anything could happen. And I mean that on both ends of the scale. We could end up going on, because our expectations are low, an incredible run and actually finding ourselves at the right end of the table. But I don't think many Posh fans at the moment would be overly surprised if we found ourselves at the wrong end of the table. I think we've got enough about us to survive. The risk of sounding maybe overconfident, I feel like there are 4 worse teams in this division than Posh. But between now and that first game, a lot can happen. And I think our biggest and most primary concern is sorting out the ownership and the issues off the pitch, because there is a real risk that we could find ourselves in a situation whereby actually just getting a team out is the priority. And again, that's not me, making sort of drama that isn't there. There is a real fear at the moment that the club could be heading in a very quick downward turn.
Well, in terms of quick, on that subject, there's Ricky J. Jones, who's I think could be in for another big season, because it felt like when he was 16 or 17, he was this really highly rated sort of teenage prodigy that was talked about with, I think Arsenal was supposedly interested, and really big future. And then for whatever reason, whether it was style, whether in a one playing up top on your own, you need to be a bit more physical, and maybe you didn't quite have those sorts of attributes. But do you see this as an opportunity for Ricky J. Jones to maybe kick on, possibly in the absence of Johnson Clark-Harris, that opens things up a bit more?
Yeah, potentially. I suppose, like some of the names we've mentioned, Burrows, Kipianu, etc. There's that gap there potentially for Ricky J. Jones, because he, as it stands, he would make it into that starting 11. He's really struggled with injuries, which has hindered his development without question. But he's one of those players who he's another one a bit like Randall that I kind of feel has stuttered a little bit over these last couple of years. Now his asset is his pace. I've never seen a footballer, or any other human for that matter, run as quickly as he does. He is ridiculously fast, and that's great. And at 16, 17, that's what got him the reputation and his name. Has he got anything else alongside that pace to make him a good footballer? That, unfortunately, remains to be seen. His decision-making is questionable. Physically, aside from the pace, he's not strong enough for the positions that we've been playing him in. There's no end product there yet. I mean, if all of these things come, then there's a player there without question. But is he consistent enough, and has he shown us enough to make it into the first 11? Probably not. But will he make it in there purely out of necessity this season? Probably. So it's a big 12 months for him, because I feel like this 12 months can make or break him. I think in hindsight, we probably should have had him out on loan a couple of years ago rather than trying to feed him into the first team. I feel like in some ways we've loved him too much almost. It's kind of stopped him being able to find his own way of playing. So, big 12 months. As we are at the moment, I'm kind of on the side of the fence of he probably won't make it beyond this level, but he's still young. He's still got that time to develop. So potentially, if he finds some form, then he could be another player that has me eating my words, really.
Yeah, I think there's probably a few players that are probably going to need to do that next season for Peterborough to have a positive campaign. I'm not expecting you to be an expert on Emmanuel Fernandez or Kai Corbett, because they've not really played much for Peterborough, barring a couple of cameo appearances. But I wondered if you had any intel on either of them and how they might fit into Darren Ferguson's plans, because presumably they're going to get more game time next year.
Yeah, so Fernandez, I would imagine, would just purely because of the defensive situation. Corbett is a player who has excited us a few times, the times that we've seen him. So yeah, I mean, he would. So if Clark-Harris does go, which I suspect he was, Tushimanga will play up front, and I suspect Corbett will be his backup. So we've not really seen enough yet of either player, I would say, to make that decision. The best we've really seen is in the Carabao Cup, which is hard to gauge teams don't necessarily focus on that with the same level of professionalism, so it's hard to kind of gauge players in that sort of setting. But both have got the opportunity, I suppose, a bit like the other players we've talked about there, to kind of forge themselves into the club this year. Whether or not they will is entirely up to them, I suppose. And the kind of development that goes with it. But I suppose they're the latest through that conveyor belt that we're trying to kind of kickstart, and we're trying to kind of push players along. It might just be that we're bringing players through perhaps a year or two earlier than we would like to, potentially this summer.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'd like to say that I was more confident about Peterborough United after this conversation, but I'd have to say you've made me a little bit less confident about the Posh as things stand. But I think there's so many unknowns. You almost need to give it another few weeks to see what happens in terms of the transfer window, who goes in and out, and perhaps in a few weeks, as optimism builds for the new season, maybe there's going to be a little bit more hope. Listen, Tim, thanks so much for your time. We really appreciate you joining us from the Yellow Block podcast as well. Talk to us about your plans for the podcast in terms of content in 23-24.
Yeah, so we had a great last season was our best yet in terms of listener numbers. The way that we've engaged, it's I suppose for us it's potentially more of the same. I think we're all quite enjoying the break just now. It's been rough these last few months, which is weird because we made the playoffs. It should be, we should be a bit buzzing, but there's never any kind of lack of excitement at Posh. Plenty to either get overly excited or kind of overly sad about it. It feels like every season. So to be honest, it's we're looking for more of the same. We're looking at bringing a couple of new voices in as well, just to kind of mix it up a little bit for the listeners. A few more features potentially as well to come in and just mix it up a little bit. We've stuck to a relatively strict recording schedule for the last season, and I think we'll look at probably doing that again going forward, and potentially looking at other sort of ways of engaging with the fans via the media, because at the moment it's very much just audio podcasts, and potentially looking at sort of doing something with the YouTube channel and stuff as well. So it's it's one for Posh fans. Ultimately, it's pretty much all we focus on there. So if you're a Gillingham fan, it's probably of no interest to you to listen to, but if you've got any interest in Posh, then give us a listen.
Yeah, I'm sure Gillingham fans will be fascinated, Tim.
Well, I've heard that they're after Ben Thompson, one of our midfielders. So maybe they should give it a listen. Yeah,
absolutely, check it out. Tim, thanks so much for your time. We really appreciate it. All the best to Peterborough United for next season and beyond. This has been EFL Debate, the Peterborough United Summer Deep Dive. We'll see you again very soon.